thanks everyone for being here. I'm sure day 3, your brains are just booming for those of you who have been part of the first 2 days, and for those of you for whom this is the first session, welcome. I want to also acknowledge the First Peoples and the traditional owners of the lands on which we all sit and work and gather today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land, never ceded. I want to particularly pay respect to their elders past, present and future. I also want to thank the presenters of yesterday's session, which covered, that was Thursday morning, yesterday, consumers, co-design, diversity themes. I don't thank them because they pretty much covered a whole lot of stuff I was going to cover. So I don't thank them for that, but I do thank them for an incredible series of presentations. And for those of you who weren't able to attend yesterday morning, I do encourage you to follow up with the videos and the because they really in general together worked so well in terms of some of the themes I'll be talking about today. So I had to, of course, spend last night thinking about how I'm going to rewrite my presentation so it wasn't repetitive and boring. But essentially, what I do want to do is look at HRECs ourselves as members, and certainly those of researchers who are in the audience, in terms of some of the changes to the national statement around composition and, you know, what I see as a move to greater diversity and inclusion. But then also look at how do we embed that in our review process? What are the challenges that we might face? What are the opportunities that exist? But then also just perhaps expand out on some of the points that were made yesterday with some specific examples around diversity, inclusion and the harms of exclusion, both historically and still currently. So that's where I'm going to go with my session. So you'd all be pretty aware that the change to the HREC composition is coming in on January the 1st. The lay category in particular being replaced with people with broader community or consumer perspective. And there was some discussion yesterday about, you know, is that a loss or is that a gain? I think that's up for individual HRECs to really think about how they implement that. But a reminder that gender diversity and diversity more broadly is also really clearly now stated for both HRECs, but any other ethic review bodies that organisations have, because many of you are in organisations or institutions that have lower risk committees or lower risk processes. So this kind of change towards a specific focus on gender diversity and other diversities covers all the ethical review process, not just HRECs. And I think that's really important to remember. Okay, so motivation and purpose. Well, we assume the motivation for this change is genuine. It came out of a consultation around the redrafting of Section 5. So I'm convinced that it's a genuine thing, but the purpose can be a little bit unclear. We know across Australia, across all boards and committees in all kind of areas of life, there has been a huge push in the last 5 to 10 years to bring greater gender diversity and other broader diversity composition into decision-making bodies and processes that exist. But I guess HRECs need to then think more broadly about their composition. And a lot of the training I run, I ask people, well, how diverse do you think your HREC is? And some will point out, well, we've pretty much only got people aged over 50. That's not representative of the population. We don't have ethnic diversity. We don't have people with disabilities represented. So there's some of the kinds of issues that I guess HRECs will be dealing with. And I guess my caution is that it should not be tokenistic identity-based. It really should be a focus on what will really work for the committee in terms of the specific focus it has. And, you know, I have already heard of 1 or 2 cases where people saying, oh, we should get someone from an ethnic community, as though that's the way you fix diversity composition on a HREC. The role of, as I mentioned, community or consumer representatives, I think, will be something that's really specific to the work that the HRECs do. So for those in hospitals, for instance, it may well be family members or patients or ex-patients. But for those of us out in the more not-for-profit HRECs or broader research community organisations, that may be a whole different approach in terms of what they see that means for them. And I guess the other thing is around implementation. Like, I think one of the really important areas for HRECs to focus on is recruitment and its transparency. And I know in the past it was like, does anyone know someone who's, you know, a religious person or a counsellor or someone working in a particular space? Whereas I think more and more there's a professionalisation coming in where, you know, it's these kinds of positions are publicly advertised and people are interviewed, and, you know, there's a whole discussion around that. So I think that's the process we should be following here. And a reminder that, you know, you can have a diverse committee, but that doesn't mean that it's an inclusive committee. So inclusion, if it's genuine, is in making that mix work. Rather than just having a group of people sitting around the table. And I guess that's the responsibility to some degree of the chair, but also all members of the committee. I want to actually throw into this mix the notion of cognitive diversity, because I think that we tend to kind of get stuck in the notions of a diversity in terms of identity or lived experience, such as a patient or in a particular kind of community that's disadvantaged. But one of the things that's so important, I think, in any committee, and I think particularly for HRECs who are doing, you know, ethical review, is cognitive diversity. We all think differently, hopefully. We all have different approaches. I know Lynn Gillam and Marilise Gilliman in 2012 wrote an article on their research project where they interviewed HREC members around how they approached reviews. And, like, you know, it was really interesting what each of the reviewers as members of HRECs, how they approached it. Like, you know, even in detail, like some would go, if there were participants, straight to the participant information form and start there. Others would work methodically through the whole application form. Everyone talked about how they had particular lenses that they, you know, were looking for, and ways of thinking about risk and ways of thinking about their individual role on the committee. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Like, you know, diversity doesn't just come with people, it comes with the process of thinking. How do we embed it? Well, there are a number of ways, and the national statement gives us license to this. We can ensure that we have access to expertise outside of the HREC. And you know, the national statement gives us particular permission to do that. So do we have connection with particular groups or of experts or those with particular lived experience that we can draw on if we get applications that we feel require greater review? And I know in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space, this is just a common process for many HRECs, but not necessarily for those involved, say, for instance, in disability focus. The other thing I think we can do is continue to remind researchers that they now have their own specific section in chapter in section 5 of the national statement. Researchers used to be just embedded in there, and now there's a 2-page section. And it's really useful for researchers to see, but also HRECs to remind ourselves about, because it's quite explicit about the many and diverse ways that information should be and can be presented to participants in order to help them to make decisions. And the old way of the 12-page pro forma, you know, that was required in hospitals, which, you know, must be given to participants, is no longer required by the national statement, if it ever was. You have to have, as a researcher and as an HREC reviewer, an understanding that the methods of imparting information and seeking dissent are really relevant and specific to the target group. Okay. And Jackie talked about this yesterday to a significant degree, so I do recommend that you have a look at Jackie's presentation. But, you know, there are many new or well-established methodologies that are really targeting and sensitive to and specific to certain populations. And I guess the challenge for us as HREC members is how aware are we of them? How open are we to them? How accepting are we of them? And how rigorous are we in terms of our capacity to review them? And how vigorous are we in asserting to researchers the principles of consumer and community involvement that the NHREC has provided? We have a role there in directing researchers to that, and also in our guidance to researchers, both verbal as well as written, saying to researchers, you know, are you aware of this NHREC statement? This is what we're going to be basing part of our review on, as to what degree you have really engaged with, in the range of ways that there are available, with populations that you want to recruit to your project. And those things include diversity, genuine approaches around diversity and inclusion. And, you know, co-design and co-production was a big focus of some of the discussion yesterday. And there's some really exciting stuff happening, including at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. So I recommend people follow up with that presentation. So there's new and exciting ways of engaging, whether it's children and young people, marginalised populations such as people who don't speak English particularly well, that have previously been just seen as no-go areas for both HRECs and researchers. Okay. I do also want to just, as an anthropologist, remind us all that 1/3 of the HRECs currently registered in Australia do not deal with clinical trials, and perhaps very little medical research at all. And yet very often we see discussions around ethics and ethics review framed very much with the underpinning of the medical model from history, and, you know, terms related to or strategies appropriate to clinical research. And I think that it's true that there's a lingering framing of social science research in terms of biomedical models. And yet social science has very different ways of understanding at certain times, notions of risk, notions of participant agency. And I think we need to be kind of aware of that. I still have heard from HREC members who say there are members on their committee who argue, well, you can't, 20 interviews is not a valid number and they need to be doing 120 for it to be valid, with clearly no understanding of quality of research methods. And certainly back in the day when I did my PhD, mine was in ethnography based in a major hospital in Melbourne, looking at death and dying and autopsy. And I wrote a really rigorous ethics application, sent it off and got ticked off. And yet what I was saying is I want permission to wander around corridors and talk to people, go into ICU, go into a range of, you know, palliative care unit. I was based in the Department of Anatomical Pathology, where I was observing autopsies, and yet the ethics committee just saw me as absolutely no risk at all. Oh, unlike clinical trials. So I think things have significantly changed, but there are approaches now in qualitative research, particularly in the ethnographic method, where things will change as you go along. You may be embedded in a community for 12 to 18 months, and you, as a result of that and your engagement with the community or communities you're working with, will be needing to rethink and change your approaches. And I guess ethics review needs to kind of be aware of that, and, you know, really focus on what kind of issues that raises and what kinds of questions they'd like to ask the researcher prior, but be aware that trust in researchers is also a legitimate thing to have. In terms of risk and agency, I think these are some of the key issues when approaching groups that have been marginalised from research traditionally. But I always go back to the 4 principles of the national statement. merit and integrity, justice, beneficence and respect. And the national statement is really clear that these values underpin all the other sections of the national statement. You always need to come back to the 4 underlying principles. And so the key ones for me that I focus on, so I know my bias as an ethics committee member, is I really focus in on justice, which is basically requiring researchers to justify their selection process, including their inclusion and exclusion requirements. Now, it doesn't mean it's not legitimate to exclude particular population groups or, age groups or so on. But what I'm looking for is a reasonable argument from the researchers as to why they think that's appropriate, as opposed to, oh, well, we're only looking at people aged 18 to 65, as though people over 65 have no relevance in society, or that people over 65 are no longer in the workforce, for instance. So you often see workforce related, that's just 18 to 65. Even in the prison research, which we constantly review, the research around people's mental health just stops at 65. And we are constantly saying 18 plus. And they're like, oh, okay. And I think respect is the other one. So respect's essentially for those, when we've got this committed to memory, don't we, is around the recognition, respect for and recognition of the intrinsic value of human beings and their right to make decisions on their own behalf. And so I think Jackie's presentation yesterday around inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities is really apt in this space. I worked as the chair of a disability ethics committee for over 10 years, and we were constantly pushing researchers to be more inclusive, and we were constantly leading them to the tools we had on our website, such as pictographs and so on, to encourage them to develop a greater capacity and confidence in including people with intellectual disabilities or cognitive impairments or communication disabilities in their research. I think we're also all pretty aware that the proposed changes to Section 4 of the National Statement represents a significant move from a focus on the perceived vulnerability of particular groups to one which is asking us and researchers generally to do more thinking around the nature of the proposal. What are the characteristics of the people who are looking to recruit? What are the circumstances of the research, and what's the context of the research, rather than the categorical approach that exists currently in Section 4. And while that will, from looking at the draft proposal in its final state, look like to some degree that will be maintained, there's a really clear introduction to the drafts section of the new Chapter 4 that's basically saying we need to think about our bias and our assumptions about inclusion and exclusion. And to what degree are we employing stereotyped opinions and untested assumptions in our reviews? And to what degree are researchers doing that? So here's an example, a really interesting paper, Good Intentions and Dangerous Assumptions. So it's a paper that's really interesting to look at because it's looking at what are the common reasons that ethics committees, and it's overseas based, so they're called, institutional ethics committees. What are the common reasons for rejection or concern raised about research involving illicit drug users? And I think we can recognise some of this in both drug users, people perhaps employed in criminal activities and so on, or research involving prisoners. So these are the things that they say are commonly raised and that they say are really untested assumptions about research involving illicit drug users. So they don't have the capacity, and in fact, there are ways that you can do a test for capacity. There was a project with homeless young people in Melbourne some years ago at La Trobe University where they had 12-year-olds who were homeless on the streets or couch surfing, and they had a clear process where they would record the interview with the young person, have someone else review that recording, and if they felt that there was an issue around that young person being drug affected, they would just delete the interview. Nevertheless, the young person got paid for their time, because it was seen as ethically really important that the views of young people living homeless on the streets in Melbourne be taken on board. And there was also a separate part of it, which was working with service users. So that leads us to, the problems around financial incentives. I'm often referring people to the fact that HMRC has clear guidelines around payments to participants, and in no way do they deny the possibility of giving people money, as opposed to, vouchers. And again, they've got guidelines which cause researchers and the ethics committee members to think about what's appropriate in that context. And the notion of re-traumatizing or re-victimizing people. I think there's a lot of research now in the family violence space, in the sexual assault space, in the child sexual abuse area that's really innovative, creative, and incredibly sensitive. And I think when we're looking at issues or concerns we might have in relation to some groups in terms of the research proposed, we need to look at what other existing research has occurred. This is the researcher's responsibility, but our need to be aware of it. That shows that this kind of work can be done and these kind of methods can be employed appropriately and sensitively. Okay, so how do we balance agency and risk? So this is a post that's been going around on the Anthropology Network recently, an international network of people working in the space. So the ethics committee at my university has rejected my application because I've asked for my research participants to choose themselves if they want to be anonymous or not. And so, this application was rejected on the basis that the researcher said, well, no, my project's on agency and I want to give agency to the participants to be able to name themselves publicly and choose to use their own name in the quotes I use or the stories I tell. Now, there are obviously issues there that can still be raised with the researcher around, does the participant really realise what the potential implications might be now and into the future? But to give a blanket refusal on the basis that participants want to use their own name really brings up some really interesting debates around to what level do we give and ascribe and allow agency in participants, and to what degree do we perceive risk? And I guess that goes to our notion as individuals and as collectively as committee members in terms of our own kind of risk spectrum that we're prepared to or comfortable with accepting. Okay. Disseminating, communicating results, I think, is another key area, and I pay a lot of attention to this because I think gone are the days when, dissemination plan and an application form is like peer-reviewed journal articles and conference presentations. Completely unacceptable anymore. There needs to be really clear plan, detailed plan around how the merit will be, the proposed merit of a project will be proved by its distribution of the knowledge that it says it's going to be developing. And again, when it comes to, dissemination to particular communities, there need to be diverse and creative methods that are relevant to those participants and those communities and the broader public in general, but also an awareness around how the presentation of results can create further victimisation. Okay, harms and cautionary tales. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it solidifies some of the concerns I've had around this space for a long time in terms of inclusion and exclusion. Okay, I just thought I'd start with something a little bit humorous. I just was reading this book last night because I buy this book every year because I love reading science that's written for the general public. And I challenge those researchers out there who are stuck in your journal articles to get out of them and get into some books that show how scientists can write really well and really accessibly for the general public, because I just think it's a joy to read books like that that really open up the space of science and what's happening in these spaces for the general public and excite them and encourage them to learn more. So this is just a small this is from a small article in this collection that's just been released for Christmas. So there's a famous study done by Jeffrey Arnott, an American psychologist, who looked at 6 leading psychology journals and found that 70% of the authors and the subjects were all American, and yet these results were being generalized across the Western world. And then a great little group of Canadian researchers who coined the acronym WEIRD, when they looked at psychology research and what was published in established and prestigious journals, essentially the vast majority of the participants were Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic. In other words, they were weird. They were from that particular cohort in those particular countries. And yet they said they are among the weird societies, members of the weird societies are among the least representative populations when it comes to generalizing about humans. So I just want to put a little bit of humor in that, but it's really important. The fact that we've had a long history of excluding population groups across many diverse kinds means that the research that we generally have and rely on still is really inadequate in many cases, and in some cases quite harmful. So I did a project with ACTA a couple of years ago. ACTA are really committed to increasing the involvement of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds in clinical trials. There is in Australia a profound underrepresentation of people from core backgrounds in clinical trials. So people are losing out on the benefits of trials and yet are being often automatically excluded from what potentially is a life-saving benefit if it's a clinical trial related to a new treatment for a particular kind of cancer. So ACTA's developed a position statement. The position statement came out of a significant literature review, both international literature and Australian literature around the involvement of called populations in clinical trials. They held a workshop as part of the consultation process and developed this position statement, which I was the author of as a result of all that information coming in. And then on their website, they have other significant resources. And they've got a bit of a framework that sits alongside some of the frameworks that were presented yesterday in terms of co-design and engagement with communities and consultation with communities, because there are different levels of involvement. And this is from the position statement itself. So really a focus on inclusive research that has equitable health benefits in terms of access, awareness and involvement, and a recognition that you need as clinical trial researchers or researchers more generally to have ongoing relationships with communities that you want to have in your current and future research. And that involves educating them about what clinical trials are, regardless of the recruitment process that you might have in place. This is another one. This is a very recent one that I came across a couple of years ago, which I won't name, but it was a multi-sited research project based in hospital ICUs in a number of states in Australia. It was not a pharmaceutical intervention. It was another kind of intervention. And it was started up because it had been introduced overseas in ICUs, and the potential benefits looked really considerable in terms of significantly reducing the time spent in ICU and the time spent in care once the patient was discharged. So it was a project that involved allied health staff. Because people were in ICU, the consent would be sought from the person legally responsible, because the participants in this sense were people who were intubated, generally unconscious. And when I looked at the actual ethics application form for this project, it specifically excluded people whose primary language is other than English. And I just quite frankly think it's unethical to do that. Here's a project that potentially offers significant benefit from people who have been in a really dire medical situation, and yet because they speak a language other than English, they are automatically excluded. And I don't know what other people think about that, but I think if I've been on that ethics committee, I would have gone back to researchers and said, come up with some ways that we can deal with this, because it's not a large body of people. We're not talking about hundreds. We're talking about certain people who meet a particular criteria in ICU. Okay, gender bias, I think, is something we're always aware of. There was a really interesting paper a few years ago signed by about 40 female academics around Australia, pointing out that Australia is well behind US, Canada, Ireland and Germany in terms of having policies that require that researchers who are funded through public money include a diversity of gender in their research, and then also produce a gender analysis, because often we don't see a really significant and deep dive into gender analysis in terms of health research. So it was involved clinical research in terms of the policies that cover overseas, but it went all the way through to animal models, which I'll come to in a moment. And we still are failures in Australia comparatively in terms of recognising sex and gender as key determinants of health, and therefore having the body of research we need in terms of improving health outcomes. And I think we're all pretty aware of the lag we've had in cardiac disease in terms of it being seen as a male rather than a female condition, and the makeup that we're having to do now in terms of educating women around the different, often different signs of heart attacks that may be occurring. And speaking of rodents, this was a really interesting research project by a University of Melbourne woman, where she analysed rodent studies, so studies that involve rats and mice, often in relation to the impact of drugs that were required for mental health conditions. 15%, only 15% used rodents of both sexes. Of those that did, the majority indicated that there were sex-specific results, that the drugs or the chemicals that were being employed in the research had different impacts depending whether they were male or female rodents. And that raises significant questions as to whether drug design and dosage actually serves the female population well. And I recommend that as a really important factor in the research that is involving humans as well. This is a historical case for me, and it's one I'll pretty much finish on. Back in the 90s, I was the executive director of Positive Women Victoria, which was the only funded support group in Australia for women living with HIV and AIDS. And for those of you who are old enough like me to remember the horror of the 80s and the massive deaths that occurred and the lack of any treatments for people who had AIDS, you will remember the excitement in the early 90s when antiretrovirals in their early forms became available. However, women living with HIV were not allowed to be part of those trials. And the argument, and like we were based at the Alfred Hospital, which was a major research centre, the argument was the women could get pregnant and the effect of the drug on their unborn child would, be unacceptable. The lack of respect for women, the lack of respect for their own decision-making capacity to decide not to get pregnant while they were getting treated with a life-saving potentially life-saving drug, and the lack of respect for women's opportunity who were facing certain death to be involved in clinical trials that may well save their lives was just honestly astounding. It's probably one of those pivotal research engagement times that just turned my mind into a furnace, really. As a result of women not being in those early clinical trials, women, when those drugs became available, women had significantly more impactful side effects than the men. And the side effects for men were pretty disastrous anyway, in terms of diarrhea and a whole lot of shocking kind of conditions. For women, they were worse. Well, guess why? They weren't trialled on women in terms of dosage. As a result of that, word got around among the women in the group, well, God, you may as well be dead rather than take any of these antiretrovirals. And you can see the result of that. Much lower intake of those antiretrovirals. And as a consequence, women died. A number of women in that picture died subsequently because they refused to go on antiretrovirals. Still impacts me today. So I want to summarise by saying, HREC members and researchers, we have an ethical obligation to ensure that the research incorporates the diversity of the Australian population as far as possible and as relevantly as possible, because some research will not be in that space. That there are approved methodologies that are conducive to supporting diversity and inclusion, and that we urgently need those processes to occur to address the existing gaps in knowledge that exist in terms of traditionally excluded populations. And finally, to call out to all of us as HREC members and as researchers to evolve our thinking and our approaches, to commit to ongoing reflexive thinking and educational opportunities such as this conference. So I do thank the presenters of yesterday, because I think they contributed enormously and really including to me in terms of learning new things around new methodologies. But it's a call out to all of us to be always open, reflexive thinking, and as well as critical in our thinking around the ways that we can be more inclusive of diverse populations and discriminated against populations. So thank you. Any questions?
Philomena, I might start if you don't mind. I mean, in a way, we only know what we know, and I guess ethics committees can be as as sensitive as possible to inclusion. But do you agree that this, in some respect, is largely dependent upon researchers to come up with the methodologies for inclusion? Because otherwise, I think ethics committees can want to be inclusive, but don't necessarily know what the best methodologies for this are. So where's the line? Where does the ethics committee's responsibility stop and the researchers,
Oh, look, it primarily sits with researchers, but ethics committees can ask questions. They can say, look, we can't see anything specific in your proposal that says that you're going to proactively be including of people with disabilities or people from core backgrounds. Have you considered it? Why not? If you considered it, what processes would you seek to employ that are different in terms of the recruitment pathway that you may use, or the consent pathway, the information sharing pathway? I put it on them, but I think it's our responsibility to ask the questions and to push them towards the NHMRC statement on consumer and community involvement. But also, I have a toolbox myself of projects that have done it well. My ethics committee has a project, we keep a little toolkit of de-identified kind of pieces of applications, and we're willing, with the consent of the researchers, to share, de-identified, and say, look, this project did this, or this is a reference to a journal article where they did this. It's not that we should have to do the work, but I feel so passionate about it that I want to do that work. And I am a researcher, so I have access to that. But in terms of our annual training as ethics committee members in the committees I've been on, we've often invited people to come in and talk to us about that, alert us to, different ways of doing data, different ways of doing consent and inclusion. So I think, think, we can be proactive in this space, but the research are the ones who have got to get it past us. But we hold the standards. The statement has the guidelines. So yeah, I mean, the ASIS guidelines exist for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. I think Jackie's guidelines yesterday that she talked about could be a potential toolkit for HRECs as well.
Yeah, and some great points. I mean, it does. I mean, not all ethics committees are created equal, but I think it is incumbent upon them to make sure they understand these issues of exclusion and how to minimise them. And of course, we heard a lot about this. I was interested in your comment on the culturally and linguistically diverse groups. And this may seem like a naive question, but has there been any research on whether or not they actually want to be researched? I mean, are there potentially cultural issues in including them in research? I'm sorry if that seems naive. It's just I'm curious.
Yeah, I know ACTA did a consultation with a wide range of state-based and national-based called organisations to engage them in the project, to talk to them about, the importance of access to clinical trials, to understand what some of the issues within their communities might be in terms of barriers or hesitations. And there are particular barriers and hesitations in terms of distrust of medical services or a need to have a family involvement when we have a Western model that really privileges individual consent as opposed to family or community consent. So, there's been a work done. And so I recommend people go onto the ACTA website, download the literature review and some of the material that came out of that. But they're not the only organisation that's doing this now, but yeah, it came from widespread consultation.
Thanks, Philomena. And just before I hand back to Natasha, a wonderful example about HIV in the 80s and women not being involved. I think it's actually quite powerful and poignant, in fact, to reflect on that sort of gross exclusion.
Yeah, it's not often you get an example when it's really clear that people literally died because of exclusion, in this case sexism and stereotypes, sexism and misogyny, quite frankly, I think, in terms of not valuing the lives of women living with HIV, and seeing them as just automatically excluded from clinical trials in general, but in particular such a needed but experimental kind of form of intervention. So I think it's a real reminder, and I use that example.
Great example, and anyone that's read the book Lessons in Chemistry will get the same sort of feeling, I suspect. Anyhow, that's another by the side. Natasha, back to yourself.
Thanks, Gordon, and thanks, Philomena. That was a really great presentation. I've scrawled lots and lots of notes all over my desk, but the chat was also very, very busy, and it's a really good way to sort of capture some of the key points of interest, I think, from the audience. Carolyn Johnson commented, I love the concept of cognitive diversity. And then there was a couple of points about how people are living longer. And I would just wanted to know if you could give us any examples of case studies with cognitive diversity and how that was addressed by the researchers and maybe also the committee.
I haven't seen it in the context of HRECs. I've seen it in the context, I'm a board member on a number of boards. And so one of the things we've been focused on as boards is diversity. So there's a lot happening in the corporate board space, and a lot written around that, which I can find and send to people around how you really think this through. But I haven't seen it in the context of ethics committees, and I'd like to see it. I think in some ways we bring that because we have our specific categories, but I'd like to see it more overtly acknowledged and enabled in a way, because you don't want a group of people, even if coming from different backgrounds, who all think the same way. Like they all have for instance, a very risk-averse approach to research. You want people who want to be able to ask questions and come at come at issues from different perspectives, and have that respected and acknowledged in the group.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for looking at substitute decision-making consents or something along those lines. Do you think that'd be a reasonable?
Yes, so that happens in disability research, and I've been involved in a national project. It was survey-based about experiences of people with disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, and they had a substitute consent kind of process. There's also some really interesting work happening in the dementia space where people give a preemptive consent for research involving them when they're no longer able to give consent, and that's a really interesting concept in itself. So I think the notion of consent, I mean, that's a whole other really interesting space in terms of how we can think differently and perhaps more elaboratively and creatively around consent, and moving it from a very fixed space into something that really supports and facilitates input of people with dementia, for instance, at a later stage, or people who are dying, those kinds of situations. Yep.
It's interesting, just talking this through when we're trying to increase diversity in clinical trials. Researchers tend to become experts in their specific area, like disability or dementia research. But when we're trying to increase access to clinical trials, we sort of need to broaden our scope with regards to our expertise. And I, putting on my researcher hat now, I'm sort of thinking about how, you do your research. I'm trying to comment when I write a paper on my methods a bit more and what knowledge was built with regards to methods, but we really need to be sharing and disseminating knowledge with regards to how our designs are ethical and robust and inclusive, and create more opportunities to be able to share that information with each other, because we do tend to fall into our silos.
Yes.
Somewhat.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think ethics committees can fall into a silo of thinking of being always critical. And people say this. I read through applications looking for things that might be wrong or things that are, deficient. And I think, we can flip that thinking, and that's another way of thinking, in a cognitively diverse way. What's really good about the applications we receive? What do we think we've learnt from the way that they've presented things? And similarly with researchers, I think researchers could have, peer groups or published kind of processes, or, repositories of like, this is great research involving, young LGBTQ people, or this is great research that was so inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities or communication disabilities. Look at how they did it. Like, I think researchers need to think about sharing that, but HRECs ourselves can be more, I think, conscious of acknowledging the positive things and the great and creative thinking that researchers have done in the applications we receive, rather than going with a lens like, they haven't got this, they haven't got that. I actually think we need to be kind of, our role is to support and facilitate research. And so I feel like as a HREC member, and this is probably a little bit more than most people want to be, I feel like I'm also a bit of an educator at times with researchers. Collectively, we come back with questions to researchers and suggestions that we think are really positive, rather than, you haven't done this. It's like, have you considered this approach or that approach? We'd be really open to you developing an approach that took consent into this direction, or, information sharing into that direction. So, come back to us with some thinking about that, because we just feel you haven't quite captured the population group that we think is appropriate. So I think we can be a bit more educative in a sense as researchers in our as ethics committee members in our feedback.
Yeah, I agree. Really, at the end of the day, members are seeing far more applications and discussing as a group these issues, and that makes them experts, and they can share that knowledge so that researchers learn and grow as well. I agree.
And I just saw a comment somebody made. Look, I can't see them all because I'm talking, but the national statement is a risk-averse document. In some ways, you can see it that way, but I see it as guidelines, and like it is a set of guidelines, and I think there's enough in it that licenses HRECs and researchers to be creative. I particularly like Section 3. I think the questions in Section 3 open up thinking rather than close it down, and I think that's a really positive part of the change in Section 3. But I do encourage ethics committee members to see them as guidelines, and we're not, you know, apart from the waiver of consent, which is the only legally binding aspect of the national statement on HRECs, which, you know, covers privacy legislation and so on. The rest of it is a set of guidelines. And if we or the researchers can justify a new or innovative approach or a more risky thing that has enormous benefit, then, you know, we are empowered as ethics committees to improve those projects.
I'm just scrolling through the chat. There's so much discussion. I hope everyone's reading it. In the interest of time, I'm just having a look through. I'm trying to grab one last discussion point, and that's on the notion of vulnerability and how you highlighted that there's been a shift from that assumption of vulnerability to, you know, trying to get rid of those stereotypes. And there was a sentence on your slide where you said, to what degree do we employ stereotypes? How, you know, what are our biased opinions and our untested assumptions? Do you have any advice or tips that you can give to people so that they can sort of look at themselves and you know, what their thoughts would be on a particular subject and how that might be influencing their assessment?
Yeah, I think we need to be conscious of our ignorance or our lack of experience with particular groups. I mean, none of us can have worked with every kind of diverse group or every difficult situation or in terms of lived experience. But we often flip into assumptions that we make. And so I think the first step is to be conscious that we're not in that group, or we haven't had that particular experience, whether it's sexual abuse or whether it's cancer treatment or whatever, and actually ask questions and look to, as I said in an earlier slide, look to develop connections with groups that have that experience and that expertise, and use them as sounding boards, as consulting groups, if the researchers haven't already done that. So I think I guess the challenge for me is always to be aware of what I know and what I don't know, and what I imagine is an experience. And like, I think one of the strengths of ethics committee members is we have really good imaginations, and we see our role as trying to imagine ourselves into the place of the participants, and that's fantastic, and I encourage that. But there are certain points where I know I just don't know what it's like to have been in that group or to have been in that situation, and I look to other people to help inform me. I look to reading that I can do. I look to researchers to inform me through the knowledge they present in their application. So there are, you know, diverse ways, a range of ways we can do it. But I think the first thing is to be less certain. And as we all get older, we get less certain because we just become more intelligent, more wise, I guess. So I think that's one thing I learned. I was much more certain in my 20s than I am now about my knowledge of the world. And I think that's a really positive thing. And it's an enjoyable thing, actually, I think.
I agree. And also, I guess that's the benefit of having lots of those voices at the table when you're doing a review of an application. Patrick has made a comment here, you know, it's important to have diversity in your committee, but also we can learn from each other as we openly put forward our experiences and our opinions and our expertise for that role that we're sitting with at the table. And Janine Little has said, I'm less wise every day.
You and me both.
I just wanted to just sort of ask you to sort of put forward a sort of a summarising comment, just from our discussion and also from your presentation, as advice to members. If they've got an application right in front of them, what should be the first question they ask themselves before they launch into their review?
I don't know that there's a one way to do it. I tend to look at what's the topic, and that already starts alerting me, because like I might be looking at a family violence project. I might be looking at one that's around mental illness or incarceration of young people in the youth justice system, and they're all different. So I guess I try and go in as much with an open mind, but being conscious of my own interests, so to speak, and that comes from years of looking at applications. And I think sometimes I like to pull myself back and go, you can get too focused on this. And I think that's what's really important is the dynamic of committees comes partly to the chair, but it's also part of the culture of the committee that is co-created by the committee members. So does everyone get a say? Is everyone's input, valued, appreciated? Do people come to meetings having read the applications? Do people come with a really fixed state of negativity? And I've experienced all of that. I've experienced committee members who come with oh, let me just find the spelling mistake that makes me think negatively about this, application, right through to people who have really anxious and ongoing concerns to the point where they're unwittingly paternalistic or maternalistic. So I think it comes to us as a group being aware that our responsibility is to be conscious of the national statement, to be employing the national statement as guidance, but also to be aware of what each of us bring, and for that to be a respectful and open conversation. But when it comes to me doing it, I hope to bring some of the learnings I have in my thinking, but also to be open to the input of others. And often, be rarely in a meeting where someone doesn't say something and I think, oh, wow, I hadn't picked that up, or I hadn't thought that. And, in good committee, you appreciate and you say verbally, well, good point, or that opens up a discussion I'm not sure this committee has really had before. And that goes to, the culture of a committee and the chairing of it and the resourcing of a committee, which is a whole other issue around how much time we have and how big our workload is. But yeah, I think they're all factors.
Yeah, I think that's a really important factor. It'd be lovely to have long, lengthy discussions, but sometimes you do have to move through quite quickly, especially the last meeting before Christmas. They're all really great points. Thank you, Philomena.
Oh, my pleasure.